Since in the last video I made some general statements about the power distinction in Western philosophy, I wanted to revisit the subject in some more detail to investigate how it fits into the theological context. One way we can start is by noting some of the key players in this scenario. Aristotle has already come up many times, but that's unavoidable. The Organon, a collection of his writings on logic, formed the rudiments of an education in philosophy, both East and West, for centuries. The single most influential theological thinker on the West was of course the blessed Augustine. Augustine's approach to the question of divine simplicity was the authoritative basis for subsequent definitions in the West. We find his clearest statements in his De Trinitate and De Civitate Dei, as Josh P. Rocheger writes. Augustine's doctrine rallies around the claim that God is what he has, hoc est quod habet. He remarks, what is meant by simple is that it, the Godhead's being, is identical with its attributes. That's the City of God 11:10. Rocheger goes on, in order to achieve an adequate understanding of how Augustine perceives God being identified with his attributes, a further distinction must be elucidated. That is, the doctrine of simplicity concerns itself not with our speech, dictio, or thought, cogitatio, about God, but rather with the being, esse, of God. We find Augustine commenting, the supereminent excellence of the divinity transcends all the limits of our wonted manner of speaking. For what is thought of God is truer than what is said, and his being truer than what is thought. That's De Trinitate 7:4. In applying this distinction to the deity, it can be seen that a multiplicity of predicates are attributed to God by our speech, but with respect to God's being, they are indistinguishable. Our third key player is Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. The corpus of the Areopagite is very important to this discussion, but the point to stress is that it is Saint Dionysius read through the lens of Augustine and Aristotle that informs Western theology. The Orthodox have taken a different reading of Saint Dionysius, which accords much more closely with the Cappadocian Fathers. Now I don't think it's possible to take just one of these influences and attempt to strawman Thomism on that basis. Rather, I think the flaws in Thomism arise from the very combination of these influences, the unique synthesis that utilizes certain presuppositions from each of our key players, whether or not they are compatible in reality. Starting in reverse, Saint Dionysius' contribution to Western theology was the notion of apophaticism, or negative theology. The understanding here is that the divine nature is utterly transcendent, and beyond every name or positive attribution we can make of it. There is nothing in common between the divine nature or essence in itself and creation, such that, as the Orthodox theologians see it, when we name God's attributes, we are naming his power and energies, not his nature. Even to describe the divine nature as good must be balanced by negation, because our concept of goodness is largely derived in conjunction with created things. When read through the lens of Augustine, this apophaticism poses some problems, at least superficially. For Augustine states that we can identify the attributes, indeed we must identify them, with the divine nature, and Augustine does not have in mind any sense of a relationship of causal dependency here, as if the attributes are energies which always accompany the divine nature, yet without possessing their own nature. Rather they are seen as identical to the divine nature. This does not mean that the distinctions of these attributes are wholly illusory, but their very differentiation is manifest only in creation, and is in a sense proper to the created order. This is where Aristotle comes into the picture. In his Summa contra Gentiles, Thomas Aquinas says that the attributes of God are not synonyms, because they do not signify the same notion. However, we must recognize that for Thomas, the various notions relate ultimately to a single, absolutely simple referent, the divine nature. Thus the differentiations themselves and accompanying notions are proper to the created order. This is an idea which Thomas derives from Augustine, as we saw in Josh Rocheger's article. With respect to God's being, they are indistinguishable. How does Thomas solve the notion of the forms, that is, the formal cause of creatures? He locates their source in the divine essence, of course, by affirming the likeness, similitudo, of the divine essence to all things. He writes, Now the divine intellect understands by no species other than the divine essence, as was shown above. Nevertheless, the divine essence is the likeness of all things. Thereby it follows that the conception of the divine intellect as understanding itself, which is its word, is the likeness not only of God himself understood, but also of all those things of which the divine essence is the likeness. In this way, therefore, through one intelligible species, which is the divine essence, and through one understood intention, which is the divine word, God can understand many things. Now this places Thomas's understanding in serious tension with St. Dionysius. This also produces tension in Thomas's own system, I believe. For he affirms that our notions about God, those which are truthful, have a basis in reality, a fundamentum in re, while still affirming the absolute transcendence of the divine essence. As I said in the last video, the way Aristotle comes into this is that the divine attributes or forms as distinct entities have their termination in the created order, and more specifically in the pure potency of matter. Matter, or rather potency, is thus the principle of individuation, and for Aristotle, as for the Neoplatonists, this entailed its simultaneity or cotemporality with pure act. As we saw in Proclus, the one is beyond both act and potency, but it is the cause of both, which are subordinate to the one, but simultaneous with one another. The definition of God as pure act in Aristotelian terms does not simply refer to God's immutability. It is rather an attempt to locate the perfections of all creatures, to use the term employed by Mark Spencer, in the divine essence. As Seraphim Hamilton has put it, take whatever qualities we can perceive in creation, be it redness or solidity or warmth, and consider that God has these in a measure that infinitely transcends the creation. For the Thomist, it is not so much that God possesses energies, however, as that he is the very summation of all things, in his essence, in a manner that transcends distinction. As Augustine said, God is what he has. As I said in the last video, this Aristotelian view would suggest that God requires matter to differentiate his operations. The orthodox view I suggested is that it suffices for God to be Trinity, for his energies or operations to be real and distinct from the essence, because the love of the divine persons manifests eternally, from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit. There is no linear termination in the sense we may give to creation ex nihilo, in terms of the execution of an operation, but a continuous movement, so to speak, without change. This is another reason why the energies themselves are really multiple in the orthodox view, because we can distinguish the eternal manifestation ad intra of the love of the Trinity from the act of creating the world, for instance. To give credit to Thomists, although they largely adopt the Aristotelian view, they do not thereby think that creation is necessary, but their means of arguing this are not especially convincing in my view. Of course, we are all in agreement that God need not have created. How we understand this to be the case, however, is not identical. We saw that for St. Maximus the Confessor, the logoi are divine wills which cannot be conflated with the divine essence. I suggested that anything that was a product of willing was contingent, in contrast to the products of the divine nature which are necessary. This appeared to have a firm basis in dogmatic theology, of St. Athanasius especially. It was Athanasius's distinction between products of nature and products of will that was upheld by the Cappadocians, St. Maximus and St. John of Damascus. It also appears prominently in St. Gregory Palamas's apodictic treatises on the procession of the Holy Spirit. It is thus genuinely perplexing from a theological perspective to find the following statements in Aquinas's Summa contra Gentiles, chapter 73, that the will of God is his essence. From this it appears that God's will is not other than his essence. It belongs to God to be endowed with will insofar as he is intelligent, as has been shown. But God has understanding by his essence, as was proved above. So therefore does he have will. God's will, therefore, is his very essence. Again, as to understand is the perfection of the one understanding, so to will is the perfection of the one willing. For both are actions remaining in the agent and not going out, as does heat, to some receiving subject. But the understanding of God is his own being, as was proved above. For since the divine being is in itself most perfect, it admits of no superadded perfection, as was proved above. The divine willing also is therefore his being, hence the will of God is his essence. Moreover, since every agent acts insofar as it is in act, God, who is pure act, must act through his essence. Willing, however, is a certain operation of God. Therefore God must be endowed with will through his essence. Therefore his will is his essence. Furthermore, if will were something added to the divine substance, since the divine substance is something complete in being, it would follow that will would be added to it as an accident to a subject, that the divine substance would be related to it as potency to act, and that there would be composition in God. All this was refuted above. Hence, it is not possible that the divine will be something added to the divine substance. However charitably we may interpret this passage, there is no getting around the fact that Thomas displays no concern to distinguish will from nature in the tradition of St. Athanasius and numerous other church fathers. We should have to start with the presuppositions of those fathers, and subsequently read them into Thomas, reading against the text, as it were, in order to find a reading compatible with orthodoxy. This is one of the reasons why in my last video I suggested that, following Aristotle, we will never practice theology proper in the sense of dogmatics. Starting out with Aristotelian presuppositions, we will be like Achilles chasing the tortoise in Zeno's analogy. The goal of theology proper will always remain out of reach. There is, I believe, ample evidence that, in fact, following the schism, the West abandoned dogmatic theology and the study of the Church Fathers, with notable exceptions, of course. In this respect, Walter J. Ong, S.J., a Jesuit academic, is well worth reading to fill out the educational and philosophical context of the Middle Ages. Discussing the University of Paris, he explains that even the theology of Aquinas played a very minimal role in education. He writes that, although scholastic theology enjoyed a theoretical priority of dignity over other forms of scholasticism, as soon as one descends from the realm of theoretical relations into the real university theatre, where Ramism and other movements and counter-movements took form, theology pales into insignificance beside the scholasticism of the arts course. The scholasticism of the arts course was thus the scholasticism which filtered upward into the entire university. No one could escape studying it. Aristotle had entered theology through the arts, and so had Peter of Spain, bringing on the nominalist crises of the 14th and 15th centuries. He goes on to say that arts scholasticism itself was not theology at all. The arts faculty was periodically warned off theological purlieus, with the respect that it tended to scant or even pass over metaphysics, which neo-scholastics today, along with St. Thomas Aquinas, consider philosophy par excellence, the first philosophy. Arts scholasticism, that is, most scholasticism, considered it a marginal subject, not to be entirely passed by, and yet dangerously close to theology for those trained only in arts. Although the race is perishing, it is still possible to encounter today scholars who have persuaded that the chief preoccupation of most medieval scholastics was proof for the existence of God, or discussion of the nature of his attributes, or the demonstration of the immortality of the human soul. Such subjects were indeed as interesting to scholars in the Middle Ages as they are now, and were occasionally treated by scholastics. But we are oversensitized to them because the grounds of discussion over which they move have remained relatively unchanged to the present day, whereas we are undersensitized to questions such as those prevailing in old physics or cosmology, the grounds of which have radically altered. But the Aristotelian cosmology was real to medieval man. When theological questions lurked in the back of the minds of philosophy professors, as of course they did, it was often to give power and perspective to an emerging natural science. While scholasticism on the whole did not tear man's mind away from the contemplation of the eternal city, it certainly did orient it towards the observable physical world more than had been usual before, as research is making increasingly clear. Irene Benini also points out the surge in interest in questions of modal logic in the generations preceding Thomas Aquinas, a preoccupation that lasted well into the later Middle Ages. The basis of these inquiries were the logical works of Aristotle and later commentaries by Porphyry and Boethius. I share Lawrence Moonan's judgment that the focus on the power distinction, in terms of modal logic, was influenced by a certain reading of St. Dionysius the Areopagite. As I mentioned at the start of this video, combined with the divine simplicity of Augustine and the metaphysics of Aristotle, the Areopagites' apophaticism entailed that the medieval scholars could only speak positively of God's power in terms of created effects, especially in terms of counterfactual possibilities. Hence the apophatic emphasis on the power distinction becomes preoccupied with what God does in creation. The focus is temporal and naturalistic. Indeed, because God is defined as pure act, and in Boethius's conception absolute necessity is identified with pure actuality, possibility in modal terms is associated directly with the potency of matter, that is, matter is the principle of individuation, which gives rise to contingencies. I think this alone demonstrates Walter Ong's point that education in the West directed inquiry more and more towards the natural and the temporal, and away from theology. This is a topic I could revisit in a future video, since it could benefit from further unpacking, but I hope this video has laid out some of the groundwork and the argument more clearly than my last.